Champagne has become the universal beverage of choice for celebrations. From weddings and anniversaries to holiday gatherings, champagne always brings the cheer. But as you pop the cork, how much do you know about that bottle of bubbly? We visited Mid-Columbia Wine and Spirits in Kennewick and talked to the owner, Mike Schmalley, to learn more about this crowd-pleasing beverage. A lot of people are going to be searching for their perfect beverage for the holidays coming up. You have champagne, sparkling wine, Prosecco, all these different choices. And when you're coming down this aisle, you might be overwhelmed. Let's first talk about the differences between those three.
Sure. So champagne is champagne. The juice comes from Champagne, France. And then Prosecco comes from Italy, and Gava comes from Spain. And then sparkling wine is primarily from the United States. So it's non-Champagne region juice. And within Champagne, you've got non-vintage and you've got vintage Champagne. So the non-vintage they produce every single year, but what they do is they blend various different vintages so that way the quality is consistent year after year. And then with the vintage champagne is when the crop is an exceptional crop for that vintage, and so they bottle it and they put the vintage on it just like a single malt scotch would be, if you will, and that's fairly expensive. Now sparkling wine, it could be champagne, and what it is, it's sparkling wine that's fermented twice. And so what happens is just regular, like Chardonnay as an example, they add yeast and sugar in the second fermentation process when it's in the bottle. And that's how you get the extra bubbles and the extra sugar in there one.
Are there flavor differences between all of them?
Yes, there is, because you have a different terroir, obviously. The champagnes are going to be more citrus, and the like the Proseccos are going to be more nutty, more fluffy, if you will, a little bit softer, and Gava is in between.
So now we're going to break it down into categories based on what someone can spend for the holidays. Let's start with bottles that are 10 and under.
Okay, so probably the most popular are going to be Andre Brut and Extra Dry. They're probably the most economical, and they're the biggest bang for the buck, if you will. You know, they're sourced out of anywhere in the United States, but primarily from California. And they're non-vintage, and they're $5.97 on the shelf. So if you have a budget that's pretty tight, I would recommend Andre Brut or Extra Brut. And we also have more options. We can always try, it's the same thing with Cooks. There's Extra Dry, we also have the Brut. Just slightly better, but I haven't compared the two to see what the difference are between them. And then my personal favorite under $10 is the Bellatori line. They make two, which is the Gran Spumante and the Moscato Rosé, and they're both a little bit on the sweeter side. And I personally like champagnes that are a little bit sweeter because they're easier to drink, especially on the lower end wines because of the sugar content that they have.
Now we're going to go to bottles that are 20 and under.
Correct. So some of the latest sparkling wines that are coming out of Italy are the Stella Rossa line. And there's 4 different ones, and Stella Rossa is a very popular Italian wine. And so what they've turned to is they've turned into their sparkling wine. You've got Moscato, then you have Black Lux, and there's a Rosso Lux, and there is a Rossa Rosé Moscato. And they're all excellent drinking bubblies. And the best part about them is they're less than $20, and they're very, very easy on the palate. Of course, our local favorite is Treveri. They make a fabulous bottle of champagne for the money, and most of their champagnes are aged 24 months, which is a rarity for any champagne that's $20 or less. And the best one that I personally like is the Blanc de Blanc, which is 100% Chardonnay, and also the Rosé, which is Syrah and Chardonnay. So some of the local favorites as well are the 14 Hands, the Brut Rosé, and the regular Brut. And these came on the market about 2 years ago. And 14 Hands, which is owned by Saint Michel, they decided they want to get into the local sparkling wine because of the climate that we have over here is ideal for making Chardonnays. And then there's also the Saint Michel Brut, the Rosé, and also the Extra Dry. Their champagne is excellent for the money as well. If you think about the money that's behind Saint Michel products, they spend an awful lot of money to make a good quality champagne or sparkling for less than $20. So champagne is where the sky is the limit. You can spend $50 on a bottle of champagne, or you can spend $5,000 on a bottle of champagne. And so the bottom tier, if you will, is a non-vintage, and that's the most common bottle of champagne. But there's also a lot of thought into the process of the bottle, and they've got several hundred years of experience in making a non-vintage champagne, which actually is very, very good. And there's like some of probably the most well recognized bottles is the Moet Imperial. This is the same producer that makes Dom Perignon. So this is the non-vintage version of Dom Perignon. And this sells for $44.97, and it's an amazing bottle of champagne for the money. And then the rosé portion side of it is this Moet Rosé. Comes in a gift box, and generally rosés are more expensive than regular vintage champagnes or non-vintage champagnes because it's more expensive for them to produce. And another popular non-vintage champagne is going to be this Veuve right here, Veuve Clicquot. And we sell this on a regular basis, and very, very popular. We have a lot of happy customers that come back and they don't mind spending the $55 on a bottle of champagne, knowing that it's going to be a good bottle of champagne.
And now let's go to, if you have the money to splurge on something.
Sure.
What are some of your options?
Right. So if you want to splurge on a bottle, my personal favorite is going to be the Dom Perignon. It comes in a gift pack. And if you think about it, this is a 2009, so this champagne has been aging in the bottle for 8 years. And again, this is where the cost comes in, because if it's an exceptional vintage out of champagne, then what happens is they sit on the bottles for quite a few years, and that adds carrying cost, if you will, for the champagne, but also at the same time you're getting a superior product. And then a step above Dom Perignon is going to be Cristal, and this is the 2006 Cristal. And again, the reason why it's more expensive is because it's a 2006 vintage. And so it's been in the bottle for 12 years, and so the longer it sits in the bottle, the smoother the taste is going to be. So one of the unique things about Cristal as well is, you can see it's in a special cellophane wrapper, and this cellophane actually protects it from UV lighting, so that the champagne never goes bad from lighting. And Cristal is one of the very few champagne makers that actually wraps their bottle in cellophane like this, so the wine or the champagne doesn't get affected by light. And
then you also have all the magnums. The magnums,
right.
If maybe have a bigger party.
And so magnums are primarily designed for like big parties. If you keep in mind, the bottle of champagne has about 100 psi pressure inside of it, and so the Magnum is quite a bit heavier, quite a bit thicker, but also the fun part about it is taking the cork off.
Yes.
Okay, because you have about 100 psi in this thing, and it pops pretty loud when you take the cork off, and that's part of the experience.
Here's a fun champagne fact. Did you know that a popped cork travels about 40 miles per hour or 60 feet per second? So be careful where you point that bottle. Up next after the break, we take you out to Treveri Cellars for an inside look at the bottling process for their sparkling wine. Treveri Cellars in Wapato is one of the only wineries in Washington to produce sparkling wine exclusively. Let's take a look behind the scenes of the bottling process with Christian Grieb. We are back here in production, and we're getting a closer look at what is called the riddling rack.
That's correct.
Is that correct?
That's correct. So what we do to make the sparkling wine is we put the wine with some sugar and yeast under a crown cap. So you can see there's looks like a beer cap basically at the top. This is what traps all the pressure. One of the products of fermentation is CO2. And obviously as that yeast consumes the sugar, it will produce the pressure in the bottle. We lay the bottle down on its side like this for a couple years to let it age on the yeast. That gives it some sort of complexity and some flavor. Trick is you don't want to keep the yeast in there, otherwise it kind of looks like Hefeweizen beer or something similar to that, and consumers like their sparkling crystal clear. So Back in the late 1700s, early 1800s, Madame Clicquot, Veuve Clicquot, you can still buy the brand today. She was kind of a kingpin, so to speak, in the industry and developed riddling. So she wanted clarity in her sparkling wines and her champagnes compared to everyone else's. So she developed this process. It's an A-frame rack, basically. And the trick is just by working the yeast will settle out to the bottom, and then you'll load it up into the rack kind of as such. And this is where you'll start. And then over the next 60 days, you do an 1/8 of a turn each day, and you keep doing the 1/8 of a turn, and you do it, and you do it. And obviously I'm speeding this up, and I'm not doing it quite accurate here, but the idea is you just keep turning, and the yeast will work itself down to the bottom of the neck. And when you flip it upside down, then you'll have all of your solids here at the bottom and clean, nice, crystal clear sparkling wine at the top. And then what we'll do is we'll let these bottles rest for just a couple days, and we'll take them in to be disgorged to remove that yeast. Nowadays we do it by machine. Yeah, the newer versions are not as romantic.
So now we are in the bottling room, and this is the process after the riddling rack?
That's correct. So, we were discussing, riddling down the yeast to the neck. What we have to do then is actually freeze it. So I can actually pull this bottle out, and you can see there's an ice plug. What we have going on in here is a ice bath, basically, so to speak. It's sugar water, and we can get it down to about 5 degrees Fahrenheit. And we trap that yeast right up in here. And below is clear, clean, sparkling wine. So I have the yeast up here in this ice plug, and I have the clean sparkling wine down here. Trick is now we have to remove that yeast.
Okay.
So that's what this process is for. So I'm just going to actually throw 2 or 3 of these bottles on here at once.
And then what's the first process?
So what we're doing is just rinsing any residual glycol off, and that's just to make sure that the bottles are clean and ready to be disgorged. The first arm here actually will disgorge the sparkling wine. So what that does is it actually removes the yeast right there in that process. It flicks that crown cap off, that little arm does. And then all that yeast goes out. The first nozzle there basically is air. It calms the wine back down. The second nozzle is dosage, which is a sugar-based solution. So if we're adding sweetness back, we can do that. And the third nipple there is actually just for fill. So that's adding some of the wine back in. So, as I advance this one more step, you'll see the dosage actually go in on the bottle. And the second, on the last bottle here, it'll actually start going in, and that's really dense, and you can see it kind of fall to the bottom of the bottle. Each of these wines then needs to be topped up to 750 milliliters. So it's actually a culmination. This right here is a culmination of 3 years in the making, so to speak. We got to pick the grapes, we've got to ferment in the bottle, and then we actually have to remove that yeast. And the bottle age, of course, is the time in between there, and then we have to work that yeast back out. So now we've taken the yeast out, we have clean sparkling wine. Now we actually have to put, a closure in it. Yeah. So I can't just send it out, without a cork. So the next process is actually corking. So with corking, the corks are oversized. What the goal with that is to keep the pressure in. The goal with the wire hood is actually to keep that cork on. There's no other goal of it, but you have to consider these wines are under 90 psi even post-disgorgement. So the next process, what this does, actually shakes that dosage back up. So you kind of saw it fall to the bottom. If we just left it there, then it wouldn't really want to, mix up. So we have to mix it up. So when we shake the bottles up, that's just kind of mixing all that dosage together, and it makes the wine actually, complete at that point. It's got its finished sugar. So if I grab the wine, it's clear and ready to go.
So if I open that bottle up today, it'd be good to drink?
Yes, I would give it at least a little bit of time, but absolutely within a time frame, then it's good to go. The next step is we actually just wash the bottles. So it'll get kind of loud for a second, but. So I just turned that off so it's not as loud, but the idea is to get them nice and clean. They're ready for a label and a capsule. So that's what the next machine is purposed for, is the finishing. And wines are ready to go at that point and ready to ship out to the public once they get a capsule and a label.
What's this machine do as far as speeding up production?
Otherwise, I'd have to hand label and hand capsule everything. So the benefit of this is we're actually automating it, so I'm not putting each capsule on by hand, crimping it by hand, and then labeling it by hand.
How many more bottles are you able to go through per day?
Sure, yeah. We can do about 350 cases or so a day, cases 12 bottles. By hand, it would be a lot slower.
Yeah.
I could probably only get like maybe 200 cases, so it's definitely less efficient by hand, and it saves my back.
This is true.
Yeah. So after this, they're ready to go. We'll box them up. We'll let them sit for just a little bit, and then we'll get ready to ship them out to the public. Well, I think sparkling isn't talked about a lot. You know, we generally know a lot about other winemaking processes as a public, right? Which is crush grapes, you get some juice, you make some wine, you maybe barrel it, and then you bottle it. With sparkling wine, there's the unknown. You know, it feels like the dark abyss for a lot of people. So we like to, you know, shed light onto that, bring people into the enlightened field of sparkling winemaking. It's definitely the most advanced winemaking process that exists.
Here's a fun champagne fact. Did you know that champagne emits 30 bubbles per second and has 3 times more gas than beer? After the break, we will visit the Hedges family estate to learn more about their family connection to the Champagne region of France. The Hedges family estate is located at the heart of Red Mountain, not only producing award-winning wine, but also making their own vintage champagne. I wanted to check back in with you guys now because the holidays are here. And what better way to celebrate the holidays than with champagne? And I know you guys produce the most amazing champagne. Tell me more about it.
Well, I can start it off. I think, you know, champagne is one only from Champagne, of course. And it started off really with a query, I guess, from my mother saying that she would not drink any sparkling wine. And I go, well, why not? And she goes, because champagne can only come from Champagne. So if we are going to do something, we need to work with a grower. So we work with a family called Gabriel and Sons, and they're a very small producer in Champagne. Actually, it was found by some partner that imports champagne in Seattle. So the 2011 vintage is our current release and available here at the winery.
So growing up in France, correct?
Yes, I grew up in Champagne in a very small village called Haussay-les-Trois-Maisons. And it's not far from a medieval town called Troyes. It is also about an hour from Épernay and Reims. And this champagne comes from the Montagne de Reims, which is probably the most famous region in France if you like champagne. Coming from Champagne, I drank champagne every single time we had people in the house.
Tell me more about the process and bringing it over here and just all about that.
Well, Christophe mentioned a Seattle importer, and his name is Jacques Boireau, and Jacques actually owns a piece of Champagne, small piece of property, which is about $1 million per acre, by the way, if you get the best. So very expensive, and that's why Champagne costs a lot. But anyway, we bring it in a 750 milliliter, we bring it in magnums, and we haven't mentioned this yet, but it is a Blanc de Blanc, which means the white of whites, and that is Chardonnay, 100% Chardonnay.
One important note too, though, is the dosage of this champagne, which is the amount of sugar that's put in to create the secondary fermentation. And so with this vintage, it has about 7 grams dosage of sugar. And so I would call this more on the dry side of champagne, more of in the realm of what I like to call proper champagne.
So when you live in Champagne and you have guests over, the first thing you do when they come in is you have a bottle of champagne with the guest. So it's a little bit probably different than what people do here. I'm
I
not
would
really
like to
sure.
do that here.
Yeah.
Yes, We also we can have a dinner made entirely with drinking champagne. And we also finish the dinner with champagne with the dessert. And that champagne could be a little bit of dry, so not as dry as something we would drink at the beginning of the meal. So champagne is a happy drink. It has personality and it makes you happy, right?
No, it certainly
Look at all
does.
the bubbles and
And if someone's interested in purchasing one of these, they can come here to the tasting room?
Yes.
Available to them?
Yes,
Because I know it's limited quantities. You guys don't get a whole lot of them.
it's about 500 bottles a year.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. The current vintage is 2011, but this is the last of our vintage for sale, and then the new vintage will come for sale probably sometime in the spring.
In the spring?
Yeah.
Right. So why don't you tell them where the name came from in the package, dear?
yes, so champagne, we needed a name for it, and we name it Champagne Marquis d'Ossé. Ossé is my village in Champagne, and we were all around the table with the family, drinking champagne, and I said to my parents and my brother, we need a name for this champagne. And my mother came up with Marquis d'Ossé because in that village we used to have a marquis, and we didn't quite like the last name of the marquis because his name was Marquis de Chambon, which sounds like jambon, which means ham. So we decided Marquis d'Ossé, Ossé being the village. And my mother passed away that year, so it became kind of her last hurrah
Yeah.
in the bubbles.
Well, what do you say? Should we pop open the bottle?
Let's do it.
No time
I
like the
think
present.
so.
Right?
Yes.
Always good, always festive. Now, my son would
Normally, yes, we would savor the champagne, but since we're in the confines of this room, I best not hurt anybody.
Break anything?
Yeah,
it's
or
raining
break
like
anything, so.
crazy outside, we'll just do it
Yeah.
inside.
Yeah.
So sometimes the best way to open a bottle, always put your thumb on the top. You have no idea what the pressure is going to be like, and it can be quite powerful, much more pressure than in the car of a tire.
When in doubt, get it really, really cold.
Absolutely.
Colder the better.
And just a little twist, and there you go.
Oh,
So
what a nice
Bingo.
sound.
Right?
easy, yeah.
For the ladies?
I always like to do 2 pours about halfway up the glass to let the bubbles settle. And then we'll go one more round so that we always have a nice, appropriate glass of champagne instead of just a tasting.
Should be about 2/3 full, actually.
When the glass is fresh, it always produces a lot of bubbles. And as you pour it, the bubbles start to subside a bit. You can see there.
So French people love to study the bubble,
Mm-hmm.
how many bubbles are coming up. Some champagne will have more bubbles, some champagne will have less bubble.
Okay.
Now,
So what does that
I'm
mean?
not sure which
And the bubbles
one
can be
is better.
small or they can be larger. Generally, the smaller the bubble, the more finesse the wine has. It's more fine, just like the bubble. But they did a study, and as it turns out, it has to do with dishwasher soap on the inside of the glass to some extent. But you don't want to pour it down the side of the glass, because then the bubbles go away. You want the bubbles there to come up, and then you just...
So it brings out more
drink it.
flavor. Is there the reason behind
It looks better.
It just looks better?
Yeah, but I think too that, champagne, part of the mystique is what we're seeing now in the glass, which is this beautiful sort of natural effervescence going to the top.
So we are going to drink this champagne in a flute. The flute is the standard shape right now for drinking champagne. However, people now are doing champagne in regular wine.
And those in
white
the
wine
real
glasses.
know will use a
Yes.
white wine glass that has a bowl to it, which concentrates the aromas better and gives you a little bit better taste
But
of the wine.
enough talk
Well,
about
cheers to the
champagne.
new year.
For the new year, for the
Santé.
holidays.
Santé.
Cheers. So one of the traditions we do, my mother being French, is a French tradition of opening a champagne without taking off the cork. However, we give it a bit of an American twist. We actually use a hatchet
which I think belonged to my father's father. So it's got a little bit of nostalgia. So pay attention. I promise not to blow up the winery, but we'll give it a try. So you want to point it out the window, very important. Find the seam, which I'm having to tell. There we go. Find the seam. You take the hatchet and you simply. There we go.
That'll teach you to do what you teach, huh?
Now it'll teach you.
Santé.
That's the same French.
Santé à la montagne rouge.